Well, welcome back to Frankfurt. I'm glad the weather warmed up a little bit for your drive. It was frigid here the last couple of
It's
days, so
on.
I'm glad that it did warm up a little bit. Um, Today's mission is fairly straightforward. It's outlined in Statute KRS 48120 2 and 3, and that is to reach a consensus on the official revenue estimates for fiscal 26 through fiscal 28 that will be used in the formation of the branch budget bills in the upcoming legislative session. I've just for notes keeping, I've listed KRS 48122 and 3 to further elaborate on our theme today. A theme that you'll hear from all the presenters from the Office of State Budget Director is what I think you asked for from last time, which is a comparison between what we did in September, the deliberations we did in September, and then the updates that have occurred since September with a new observation of historical data and a new econometric forecast. So, speaking of econometric forecast, I'll conclude the introduction and turn it over to Michael Jones to walk through the state and national economies.
Do you mind flipping over to the? You want me to do it?
Hit escape. It's easy.
Sorry.
There you go.
You'd think we'd be better at that by now. Well, good morning. It's always wonderful to see all of you. And as Greg said, we are going to mostly discuss what are the key differences in the S&P Global forecast between our presentation in September and now. And let me jump right to bullet point number 2. It is interesting, of course, that we had a longer than expected government shutdown, and that required S&P Global to use alternative sources rather than the normal data provided by BEA, BLS, and other government agencies to prepare their forecast. That caused them to get a little more creative, and they, I believe, did have to do a little more work than usual, but it looks like they put together a forecast that is encompassing all of the questions we would want to have answered. So what are some of the main differences? Well, first off, GDP growth has been revised up in the near term and down in the outer years. It increased from 1.8 to 2.1% in the current year, and has been revised down from 2.3 to 2.1% growth in fiscal 27. Fiscal 28 is essentially unchanged. They did include increased disposable income due to the recent tax law changes, and they also included the increase in government expenditures and gross investment due to the changes in the House Reconciliation Bill. We have a reversal of the weightings between optimistic and pessimistic. The optimistic is now weighted at a 30% probability. Previously it was 20, and pessimistic has now assumed the remaining 20% versus the 30% that pessimistic was weighted when we had our presentation in September. The pessimistic scenario now includes a recession. We're in it. They forecast that we are going to have a 2-quarter recession starting this current calendar quarter. This is, of course, second quarter of fiscal 26, with a non-annualized decrease of GDP of 0.3%. Other variables that have had a significant change compared to last time, it would be manufacturing employment. Of course, one of the variables we focus on for the waterfall down into the Kentucky economy is what's happening in manufacturing. And in both fiscal 27 and 28, it is more pessimistic in all scenarios. Wage and salary disbursements, stronger growth in 27. The current control forecast assumes 5.3% growth versus 4.5% presented last time. Unfortunately, housing starts are weaker in 27 by quite a bit, now an actual decline of 1.5% versus a slight growth in the previous forecast. And consumer sentiment, in fact, it is within 0.3 points of being the lowest ever recorded currently, and the forecast has a significantly weaker consumer sentiment in fiscal 26, with a 9.2% decline versus a 3.1% decline in the previous presentation. The before-tax corporate profits, the estimation is now more optimistic in the near term, but more pessimistic in fiscal 27 and 28 in all scenarios, with the assumption that businesses are going to have a much harder time passing along tariff increases and cost of doing business, and that they are going to have reduced profits rather than passing on in an attempt to maintain market share. And then specifically in the Kentucky non-farm employment, significantly weaker in fiscal 26, with the current control forecast dropping by 0.3% to 0.6% growth versus the nearly 1% growth we had presented last time. So what's actually in the control scenario? Again, like I said, weighted 50%, just like last time. We have real GDP growth of 2.1% in the current forecast, below trend in the out year in fiscal 28 of 1.6. Continued reduction in business fixed investment due to the rescission of the CHIPS Act incentives. The S&P Global forecast makes a significant point that all of the spending on data centers is not expected to have as much of a spillover effect as the manufacturing spending that would have been associated with the building of the chip plants and other things that have been provided incentives under the CHIPS Act incentives. So therefore, it's a net reduction overall in business fixed investment. The Federal Reserve is assumed to cut in December. We've peeked behind the curtain. We know they did. But the S&P Global forecast assumes that there will be no more rate cuts until June of 26 in the control scenario. The trends in payroll growth continue to decline. Unemployment rate rising to 4.7% by the third quarter of fiscal 27. That was 4.5% in the previous presentation. So a little higher assumption on unemployment in the control forecast. And it also adds on new additional tariffs levied on semiconductors and critical minerals. This leads to core PCE increasing to 3.8%, which is slightly less than what was presented last time, which was 4% in the previous presentation. In addition to the fact that the pessimistic scenario, while weighted lower at 20 versus 30, as I mentioned, and assuming that we are currently in a recession, it does assume that GDP growth slows to 1.3% in the current year and 0.3% in fiscal 27. That was 1% in the previous pessimistic forecast. Again, two-quarter recession that we are currently in, but the overall outcome in fiscal 27 is 0.3%. So it does eke out a positive, even though it assumes that we are currently in a slight recession. The non-farm employment increased by 0.2% in fiscal 26, with a decrease of 1% in fiscal 27 and 0.7% in fiscal 28. That compares to negative 0.7 and negative 0.5. So more pessimism in non-farm employment as compared to last time. Consumer spending is also expected to flip. It was slowing to 1.5 in fiscal 26 and has a negative growth of fiscal 27 of 0.2%. That was previously assumed to be a positive 0.5%. So an overall decline of 0.7%. And then the unemployment rate increases to 6.7%. It had been 6.3% in the previous forecast. And lower world demand lowers oil prices to $54 by the third quarter of fiscal 27. That was under $50 in the previous forecast. Now, the optimistic scenario, in addition, like I said, now assumed to be 30% weight versus 20% in the previous forecast. Stronger GDP growth, but not as strong as we presented last time. Stronger than we presented last time in the near term, 2.9 versus 2.6, and 2.7 versus 2.8% in fiscal 27. Employment increases, slightly less optimistic than last time, 0.7% in the current fiscal year versus 0.9% in the previous presentation. Real personal income growth took a little bit of a haircut in the optimistic outlook. 2.1% in fiscal 27. It had previously been 3.3% growth, and 1.1% growth in fiscal 28, and that had previously been 1.4%. Real consumer spending, stronger in 26. Again, the passing of the tax and appropriation bills is assumed to pull additional income and disposable income for individuals, as we have now locked in the tax rates that had originally been done under the original Tax Jobs Act under the first Trump administration. So real consumer spending increases by 3.4% versus 2.5% in the previous presentation, and the same in fiscal 27 of 3%. And in the optimistic scenario, unemployment goes just a tick higher, 4.4% versus the 4.3% that was presented last time. Now, for GDP, I'm going to show all the slides. Let me say that to keep the packet a little slimmer and to move the presentation along faster, I have not prepared this. I have not planned to present the same number of slides for each variable. However, the slides have been prepared. If there's at any point you would like to see any of the slide presentations of previous versus current forecasts across any scenario, I do have that information available. So here we have real GDP in the current forecast. Obviously, you can see that slight bottoming out, a slight negative in the pessimistic forecast, and then it resumes growth again, indicating the current recession, and it again for 2 quarters. The optimistic and control obviously assume a more relative growth pattern compared to what we've seen in the past few fiscal years. Move to the mouse. So this slide lays out, of course, our different forecasts. You can see in the control forecast, 2.1% in each of the fiscal years, 26 and 27, a slight downturn to 1.6 in the control forecast in the out years. Obviously, the optimistic is more optimistic with 2.9 and 2.7 in the current years and in the next year. And then obviously the pessimistic forecast, 1.3, dropping down to 0.3. Again, like I said, it does eke out a slight positive, even though the fiscal 27 number would include us coming out of a 2-quarter recession. And I'm not sure why the mouse stopped working. I apologize. So here's the presentation of the control forecast. As was presented last time in the red column, that is what was presented in September. The blue column is what is being presented now. And you can see more optimism in the control forecast in the near term, slightly less optimistic in 27, and approximately the same growth rates in fiscal 28. In the optimistic forecast, it's the same story. Slightly more optimistic in the near term, a little more pessimistic in fiscal 27, and essentially unchanged in fiscal 28. And in the pessimistic forecast, more optimistic in the near term, much more pessimistic in 27, 0.3% versus 1% growth, and essentially unchanged in the out year. Like I said, I have prepared those slides, and if at any other variable you would like to see that any of those slides, I'm more than happy to show them to you. So now we have U.S. employment. As you can see, there's a stark difference between what is assumed in the pessimistic forecast versus the almost identical optimistic and control forecasts. In the case of the pessimistic forecast, that would be assuming a full 1% drop in fiscal 27 and an additional 0.7% decline going into fiscal 28. In terms of the control forecast, you can see that, again, they've become a little more pessimistic in employment in the near term in fiscal 26, and then slightly more optimistic in 27, and fiscal 28 is essentially unchanged. The optimistic forecast is essentially unchanged compared to last time, and the pessimistic forecast is just slightly more pessimistic. Unfortunately, in the case of manufacturing, there is more pessimism all the way around. As you can see from the pessimistic line, there is a significant decline in the forecast for manufacturing, while the decline in the control and the optimistic is slightly reversed from our normal presentations. You might remember last time we talked about this. This has to do with the assumptions on the onshoring, the reshoring of manufacturing in the optimistic scenario and how tariffs are handled. That is why the optimistic is below the control, which again is normally not the case in our forecast. In the case of the control forecast, that is representing a 0.8% decline in fiscal 26, an additional 1.7% in fiscal 27, and a slight 0.5% decline in the out years. That pessimistic forecast is quite pessimistic. That fiscal 27 drop is a 4.4% decline in the manufacturing forecast for fiscal 27. That compares to 3.7% last time, so certainly more pessimistic than previously presented. And in the out year, another 2.3% decline in the pessimistic forecast in 28. But in the control forecast, you can see that again, this repeated, you're going to hear me say, more optimism in the near term, more pessimism in fiscal 27. And you can see that in the control forecast, they brought up the forecast to only a 0.8% decline in the near term, followed by a 1.7% decline and a 0.5%. Previously, in the control forecast, we had eked out a gain by the time we got to the out year, and that is no longer the case in the control. And as I said, the pessimistic is far more pessimistic. Real personal income, you can see the overall growth rates there. That's approximately a 3.1% growth in the control forecast in fiscal 27. The optimistic is much more optimistic at 3.8% growth, whereas that pessimistic forecast, not quite as pessimistic as you would expect, given the fact that the pessimistic forecast does include a short-term recession, but the growth rates are quite slow, 1.3% in fiscal 27 and 2.1% in fiscal 28. In terms of the control forecast, again, a little more optimism in the near term, slightly more pessimism in fiscal 27, 28 essentially unchanged. Now, wage and salary disbursements, there's almost no difference in the control and the optimistic scenario, but in the pessimistic scenario, we do see slower growth than we see in the control forecast. This represents approximately 4.95% growth in wage and salary disbursements in the control forecast, whereas the pessimistic forecast is a little bit slower, 3.8 and 3.2 in the out years. Again, compared to the control forecast previously presented, a little more optimism in the near term, a lot more optimism in wage and salary disbursements for fiscal 27. And again, this is due to the change in disposable income associated with the Tax Act being passed. And you can see that we have a significant increase, 4.6% in fiscal 27 in the previous presentation versus 5.3% in the current S&P Global forecast. Real consumer spending. Now, this, of course, is definitely a tale of two stories, with that pessimistic line showing declines, whereas the control forecast has continued growth we've seen in the past, and the optimistic being slightly more optimistic. In the case of the control forecast, that's approximately 2.4 to 2.2% growth each year. That pessimistic forecast in the current year, 1.5% growth, but then an actual decline of 0.2%. So again, the pessimistic forecast, including that recession, we see instead of a positive 0.5%, which we presented last time for fiscal 27, we now are expecting in the pessimistic forecast to be a decline in fiscal 27. In terms of the control forecast, essentially unchanged in fiscal 27, more optimism in the near term and slightly more pessimistic in the out years. Out year, I should say. Housing starts, again, much like manufacturing employment, we have a strongly different tale between the control and the pessimistic. You can see in the housing starts, that's actually a decline in the control, but it's kind of well, you don't know how bad it could be when you compare it to the pessimistic, because in the control forecast, that represents a decrease of 3.9% in the current year, now a decrease of 1.5% versus previously it assumed it would be positive in fiscal 27 and then just ekes out a slight gain. Now you compare that to the pessimistic forecast. The pessimistic forecast assumes an 8% decline in the current year and an 11.3% decline in fiscal 27 and continued declines in fiscal 28 of 2.9%. So the pessimistic forecast is much more pessimistic than what was presented last time, and certainly more pessimistic than the control forecast. Retail sales, including food service, again, you can see a slowdown in growth, but there is growth in the pessimistic forecast. The control forecast continues approximately the same 3.2% growth that we've been experiencing over the last several years. And if you compare it to previous, it's essentially unchanged. In terms of retail sales, the forecast between September and the current year is unchanged, and that is true across all the scenarios from September to the current presentation. Here's our consumption of gasoline and oil. As you can see, the pessimistic forecast does have a very strong decline. The control forecast has a decline, 6.2% in the current year and 3% in fiscal 27, followed by a slight uptick in fiscal 28 of 2.3%. Now that is sharply different than what was presented last time. Last time it was assumed we would be having an 11% decline in the current year in the control forecast, followed by a slight decline in fiscal 27 of 1.5, with a large increase in fiscal 28 of 8%. So we went from an 11% decline in the current year to a 6.2% decline. We went from assuming a slight 1.5% to an additional 3% decline in the fiscal 27, and instead of a large pop of 8% in fiscal 28, it's only 2.3%. And you can see that as we compare in the control forecast, you can see those changes. It's essentially the same story, only slightly different amounts, as you might imagine. In the pessimistic forecast, the decline is 9% versus the current 6.2, and the other years are essentially the same as the control forecast. Unit sales of light vehicles, again, one of the most important variables for the Kentucky forecast, given our large presence in the motor vehicle industry. Obviously, that pessimistic forecast is quite pessimistic. The control forecast does have a near-term drop. That's 2.9% decline in the current year, followed by very slight gains in the out years. This is the presentation from last time. We had assumed a 6.9%. Now we're assuming 2.9% decline. So obviously more optimistic relative to last time, but still a decline, which of course is not good for the Kentucky economy. And a little less optimism in 27 and less optimism in 28. Now, in the case of the pessimistic forecast, you saw that large decline on the line chart. That is a 7% decline in the near term. It was assumed to be 11.4% decline in the previous presentation. So again, more optimism, but still large declines. And so the current forecast, 7% decline in the pessimistic forecast for new light vehicles, followed by a 3.3% decline, and then a 2.7% increase in the out year. Real exports of goods and services, all of these just look great. That is a strong amount of growth that the S&P Global forecast is assuming. Look, the control forecast is essentially the same as the optimistic and pessimistic in terms of what was presented last time. Again, a slight more optimism in the fiscal 26 number, 0.7% versus 0.5%, and then just an ever so slight decline in fiscal 27, but then again, more optimism in the current forecast for fiscal 28. And the forecasts for the optimistic and the pessimistic are essentially the same in terms of more optimism in the current year, a little less optimism in 27, and more optimism in 28. Again, another variable very important for Kentucky, real exports of motor vehicle parts. You can see that all the forecasts assume growth in the out years, not as much, of course, in the pessimistic forecast. Compared to last time, slightly more of a decrease in the current year, followed by more optimism in fiscal 27 and fiscal 28. And it's the same across the optimistic and the pessimistic forecasts. A little more pessimism in the current year, more optimism in the out years. The Consumer Sentiment Index, as I mentioned before, is nearly reached an all-time low. Consumers did a huge about-face when asked how they feel in the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Survey. As you can see there, that negative decline in the pessimistic forecast is a decline of 19.5% compared to the previous year. That is one of the biggest turnarounds that has ever been forecasted by S&P Global. And you can see if you compare the control forecast, we had been presenting a 3.1% decline. That's now assumed to be 9.2%. And again, it's 19.5% in the pessimistic. Yes, ma'am?
Do they give any reason for why they think it's dropping 19%?
They basically put it all to the consumer concerns over affordability, tariff impacts, the lack of household formation, and just a general, for lack of a better term, take you back to the 70s, a malaise, if you will, of just the average consumer feeling as though they're not getting ahead. But you do see that it does come back in fiscal 27 and 28. But again, percentages, increases off of those low numbers. This doesn't mean consumer sentiment will be high. It just means that compared after a previous decline in fiscal 26, we do see consumer sentiment climbing in fiscal 27 and 28. Of course. We do, as you might imagine, a lot of them are the large variables. Now, as you might imagine, when the December forecast came out, I couldn't help but take a peek. You know, you like to see who did it in the end. And in the case of the S&P Global forecast, I am happy to tell you that the December forecast, which has been published, but of course could not be done and incorporated into what we're presenting here, is essentially unchanged from the data that is being presented here. In fact, they pat themselves on the back and say, wow, those variables we forecasted, they seem to be coming in right about where we said they would. So this is why you subscribe to us. And they, of course, you know, have a slip at the end that you can renew your subscription. So they do feel like they did a good job forecasting, especially jobs, unemployment. They used the same trick that we used. They were still publishing the continued unemployment claims at the state level. They just rolled them up into the national level. There was Challenger, Gray, and Christmas was still putting out their data. Of course, ADP and other private payroll processors were putting out their data. So they used a long-term relationship between BLS, BEA data, the private data, and they forecasted out using those. And I'm sure there's more magic sauce that they use than we use, but it does seem like they feel as though they did accurately predict and properly structure their forecast to match what actually has turned out to happen. Obviously, we are running in arrears. I know Thomas and I have had several discussions on when we expect some of the future reports to be released, and if some reports, of course, may never be released.
I'm just wondering what they think changes next year that makes all of these forecasts start to tank.
Honestly, I think they believe that because they had to adjust tax withholding and people are going to start seeing larger take-home pay and they're going to see larger refunds, I think they feel like money in the pocket is going to cause people to turn around a little bit. And I think they believe that there's going to be a little bit more of a settling of the impact of tariffs. And I think, of course, they also believe that for the most part, I will say this, the control forecast assumes a 12% decline in the broad stock market over the next 2 years. But I think they believe that the wealth effect will be, the negative wealth effect of a change in the stock market will be outweighed by the increase in net take-home pay due to locking in the tax rates and larger tax refunds.
Just follow up.
Yes.
Your comment about the consumer expectations. I was looking yesterday at the Conference Board's index of leading indicators, and consumer expectations was the biggest negative factor in the last month or two indexes. So they're certainly consistent. I don't recall which one the Conference Board uses for their measure, but that's consistent, I guess.
The consumer price index, we normally don't do the line graph, so in this one I did present the comparison across. As you can see, there's not a lot of difference in the expectations for the CPI, all urban, across the different forecasts. In the control forecast, 2.9% growth in the near term, 2.8% growth in fiscal 27, and 2.3% growth in fiscal 28. Obviously, the pessimistic, the growth is smaller, but that's for all the wrong reasons, and that, assuming a slowdown overall, leading to less power for prices to go up. Here's how it compares to last time. Essentially unchanged in fiscal 26, slightly higher in fiscal 27, and slightly lower in fiscal 28. And here's the core consumer price index, obviously excluding food and energy. And you can see in the current control forecast, again, a little higher in fiscal 26 of 3.2%, followed by 2.8 and 2.3% growth. And essentially, this is unchanged from what was presented last time. Here's the control forecast. Again, if I have to go 2 decimal places, you know there wasn't much of a change. And you can see slightly more in fiscal 27 and essentially unchanged in fiscal 28 again. There is one variable that I had to go 3 decimal places to show any change. So truly, in some cases, there really has been next to no change in the forecast from September to now in some variables. And before tax corporate profits, again, there's a discussion of whether or not corporations will be able to pass along tariff cost increase, whether they'll have to absorb them. And you can see, of course, in the downturn assumed in the pessimistic forecast. But in that control forecast, we're looking at 4.6 to mid 5% growth in the control. And that is reflective of nearly 8% growth in the optimistic forecast in the out years, 8.1% and 8.4% in fiscal 27 and 28, respectively. However, I believe there is a data error on this slide, so I do not want to discuss this slide. I noticed it as I was going over my notes this morning. So, whoops. Sorry. So again, just focusing on this chart right here. Again, in the control forecast, this represents 4.6, 5.8, and 5% growth, respectively, in each of the years. That optimistic forecast is 5% growth in the current year and 8.1 and 8.4% growth in fiscal 27 and 28. The pessimistic forecast is quite interesting because it assumes a slight growth in the current fiscal year of 3.3%, a negative 0.1% in fiscal 27, and then back to 5% growth in the out year, much like the control forecast, but of course off of a lower base due to that negative fiscal 27 number. So drastically different forecasts and before tax when you compare control optimistic and pessimistic. And I apologize for the error on that slide. State and local government personal tax receipts. As you might imagine, the pessimistic forecast would assume a slowdown, whereas the control and the optimistic assume fairly strong growth, similar in percentages to what we just presented in the corporate tax pre-tax profits. In the control forecast, that assumes 4.6% growth in the near term, 5.8% in fiscal 27, and 5% in fiscal 28. And again, strong growth of 8.1% and 8.4% in the optimistic forecast. Compared to the previous presentation, you can see slightly more negativity in 26, a little more optimism in 27, and essentially unchanged in fiscal 28. That is all of the S&P Global. I'm sorry, there'll always be Global Insight to me. I was going to say that's all of the S&P Global slides. I did go through them quite quickly. If there's any variables you would like to discuss or see more detail, I'd be happy to provide it. All right. Okay. In terms of the Kentucky non-farm employment, as you can see, a stark contrast between the control and the optimistic and the pessimistic forecast. You can see that negative is a negative 0.7% in fiscal 27 and a negative 0.6% in fiscal 28, and that is more negative than what we presented last time. Both years had declines, but they were both 0.5% in the previous forecast. Now, in the control forecast, you can see that we have 0.4% growth, followed by 0.5% growth, and slowing down in fiscal 28 to 0.2%. And you can see in the optimistic, much stronger growth, 0.6%, 0.7%, followed by a moderation to 0.3% in fiscal 28. Now, of course, in the Kentucky variables, we also like to compare them to the U.S. And you can see that in the current control forecast that we are expecting slower growth in the Commonwealth than what the U.S. is expected to have as a whole. You can see the larger difference in fiscal 26, and it continues to narrow as we get out to fiscal 28.
Quick question.
Yes.
On just the data, how many actual months are in the fiscal 26 data? Generally, I mean, it may vary different by variable, but.
In this case, it would be done quarterly,
Right.
and this would have had the first 2 quarters of the year. I don't know if Gene had the third quarter.
The first quarter, in calendar quarters when you say that.
Okay. So in this case, the fiscal 26 forecast would have 6 months if he did not have the most recent quarter completed.
Right, so I say 6 months, you mean, we're not through the second quarter, of our fiscal calendar basis.
I'm sorry. Are we asking calendar quarters
Well,
or
the
fiscal?
data's all on fiscal year basis, so I'm
Yes.
saying how many, you have the first 3 months of the fiscal year in it?
Yes.
Okay, so generally the data has actuals through September then.
I believe that is correct, yes.
Okay, great, thanks.
So, and then you can see that compared to September, we're more pessimistic in fiscal 26, slightly more optimistic in 27, and more optimistic in fiscal 28. And that is the case also in the alternative scenarios. Manufacturing employment, again, following along from our discussion earlier on manufacturing employment at the U.S. as a whole, you can see that there's expected declines across all scenarios, but the control forecast is much more moderate of a decline than what the pessimistic forecast would be predicting. In the case of the control forecast, that would be a negative 0.8% in fiscal 26, 0.9% decline in fiscal 27, and a slight 0.1% in fiscal 28. And that compares to what you see there in the pessimistic forecast of a 1.3% decline in fiscal 26, followed by a 2.9% decline in fiscal 27, and a 1.2% decline in fiscal 28. Again, compared to the U.S. as a whole, our forecast is for us to have slightly less of a decline in fiscal 26, a much significantly reduced decline compared to the U.S. as a whole in fiscal 27, and again, doing better than the U.S. as a whole in fiscal 28. Compared to what we presented in September, you can see, though, that we are more pessimistic. 0.8% in the current forecast for the current fiscal year versus 0.4% last time. Again, increase of 0.4% in fiscal 27 to the negative side, and but in fiscal 28, more optimism, only a 0.1% decline versus 0.4% presented in the previous presentation. And it's the same story in the alternative scenarios. In the case of the pessimistic scenario, last time we had assumed a 2.1% decline versus the 2.9% decline in the current pessimistic forecast. So again, a little more pessimism in fiscal 27. Here we have personal income. You can see that the optimistic and the control are very slightly different, but again, a little bit more of a slowdown in the pessimistic forecast. And you can see that, as usual, we are expected to have slower growth in personal income than the U.S. as a whole, with 4.6, 4.7, and 4.1% in the control forecast versus the 5.2, 5.6, and 5% at the national level. Compared to last time, slightly more pessimism in the near term, a little more optimism in fiscal 27, and essentially unchanged for fiscal 28. And it's essentially unchanged across all the alternative forecasts as well. Kentucky wages and salaries, very similar to personal income, almost no difference in the control versus the optimistic forecast, but with a slight slowdown in the pessimistic forecast. As you can see, compared to the U.S. as a whole, again, much like wages and salaries, we're expected to slightly trail the U.S. as a whole. And compared to what was presented last time, essentially unchanged in fiscal 26, a little more optimism in 27, and essentially unchanged in fiscal 28. And that is essentially the same story in the alternative scenarios. In the pessimistic scenarios, we are more optimistic than previous presentations in 26 and 27, but ever so slight. And last but not least, transfer payments. We typically do not do a line graph for these. You can see that in the current forecast, essentially the scenarios are unchanged from last time and very similar. When you have to go 2 decimal places to show the difference between optimistic and pessimistic, you know there's really not much of a difference in the forecast. But you can see that we are assuming growth in the near term in transfer payments, and then continuing decline in the out years. And of course, how the impact of the changes in the Medicaid program play out in Kentucky is going to be of significant interest, as we expect there to be a reduction in the amount of available tax credits for individuals who obtain their health insurance through the exchange programs. And this compares to last time, as you can see, ever so slightly increased in fiscal 26, 6.7% versus 6.4% growth presented in September, and we're essentially unchanged in fiscal 27 and fiscal 28. And that's all the Kentucky variables. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to. Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm sure there's not a simple answer for this, but under the pessimistic scenario, the Kentucky non-farm employment, so this is really about the MAC model. That's probably why it's not a simple answer. The Kentucky non-farm employment that's like a substantial decline. So that's all employment. That's not just manufacturing.
Yep.
But yet under I know that there's more to personal income than just jobs, but I would think jobs would be where we get most of ours.
Sure.
And so, but the pessimistic under Kentucky personal income is lower than the rest, but still going up substantially. So is there a simple answer for why, if we think the pessimistic scenario is correct, that we think Kentuckians are going to lose jobs, but their income is still going to go up pretty significantly for all 3 fiscal years?
Well, I would have to say that the way the MAC model works, I would assume that and I'll let Gene speak to this if he has specific comments, but it would be my thinking that the way the variables come in from the global insight, S&P Global model, and relate to Kentucky employment, my guess is that the outweigh, again, the transfer payments that would be increasing under the pessimistic scenario would help offset the direct loss of jobs. And I would assume also, again, that all forecasts are holding constant. The increase in the take-home pay for those who keep their jobs in, due to the tax law changes. But as far as a direct relationship between the two, I would not be able to tell you exactly why we would get that type of a result from the MAC model.
Yes, which makes sense. I mean, I know the MAC model has lots of interaction variables and lots of different things that are coming into it. But I only bring that up because the pessimistic in some of these, you know,
Sure.
the pessimistic is like a 2-quarter recession.
Yes.
So
It's-
I wouldn't call that super pessimistic.
Right.
But even if that's the case, the model that we have says that even if we have that pessimistic, that Kentucky personal income is still being shown to go up.
That is correct.
Not as much as control and
Right.
optimistic, but
Yes.
we don't have anything from the MAC model that shows that even if we have a pessimistic forecast, that Kentucky income is actually going to come down.
That is correct.
That's right. Okay, thank you.
If there's nothing else, thank you so much.
Mr. Chairman, you want to proceed with the revenue slides? Okay. The only introductory slides that we have for the revenue slides is just a recap of receipts. Since you've been here, we've had September, October, and November receipts come in. I know that you all get those. If you don't get them, please reach out to me. We do a press release and put out numbers, and if you want additional numbers, we would be happy to send them to you. But we're going to start with September. It was down 2.8. I'm sorry. September declined 1.5%. It was down 2.8 for the first quarter. So the first quarter of revenues in fiscal 26 was a decline. Declines in general fund receipts are not all that common, but we did see one in the third quarter of fiscal 25. So it's not been too long since we've had a negative quarter in general fund growth. Sales
Greg?
tax, yes.
Could you put that on presentation? Could you presentation?
I beg your pardon.
That's all right.
That's okay. I'm sorry. Here we go. Sales tax grew 3.5% with good collections. 3.9% growth in the first quarter. September capped off the first quarter. And I make a big point of 3.9% growth. Historically, 3.9% growth is not huge for the sales tax, but it is coming off a 0.0% quarter in the fourth quarter of fiscal 25. So sales tax, even with 3.9%, I would say is picking up. Individual income tax fell 1.1%, but it's up 7.2% for the first quarter. Largely due to 88% of the money was withholding, and it went up 7.5%. Withholding went up 7.5%. Major business taxes fell 44.5 million, and it was down 41.8% for the first quarter. You may recall that last time when we presented July's results. In July, major business taxes were down a couple $100 million, and that was due to the non-recurring situation we talked about, where we had 3 non-recurring payments totaling about $400 million in fiscal 25. So one of them was in July, and that was the big one, over $200 million. So we're down 41.8% for the first quarter. October was another decline, 0.5%. Sales tax was a good month, 6.5%. Individual was a good month, 5.7% growth. Year to date, 6.9% growth, which is outstanding. You can see the parts of the individual income tax. Again, the major story is the major business taxes declined $118.4 million, and that was attributable to the three non-recurring months are July, October, January. This is October, so we had about an $80 million non-recurring headwind from fiscal 25. So we did see a decline in major business taxes, but October was encouraging in that the two largest accounts, individual tax withholding, I'm just talking about the withholding part, and sales and use, are up 6.4 and 6.5% respectively. And that's strong growth in our major two taxes, which again is right around 74% of the total general fund. I do have a slide for November, which was hastily put in because November receipts came out. We didn't get the data until right around December 10th, so we did put a slide in for November receipts, up 9.2%, great month. Individual income tax jumped 21.9%. You may recall that when we had the storms in early February, there was an executive order that allowed taxpayers and all affected taxpayers in all 120 counties to delay their filing from April 15th to November 3rd. So November, we did see some extra money in returns that were that normally would have come in April. So we did get a little bit of a bounce from that. Even with that bounce, it was a great month. Sales and use tax, again strong, 3.4%. Year to date, it's down a little bit, 5.9%, but still great. And major business taxes continue to decline. There's no non-recurring issues for November, so that's just a straight decline of 20.6%. And year to date, they're down 50%, 50.6%. I'm going to skip the next two bullet points and jump to the main conclusion of receipts year to date. We've seen growth in sales tax, $143.7 million. We've seen growth in the individual income tax. It's up 194.9%. Those two, were roughly flat year to date on our receipts, and that's been nullified by a $360 million decline in major business taxes. $360 million kind of wipes out the sales and individual income tax growth. Now, I will say $360 million sounds like a big gulp in a $1.5 billion tax. But keep in mind that of the 360, about 300 of that is two of the three non-recurring months, July and October. So that was 300 of the 360. So really kind of, if you want to look at it, major business taxes are only down 60 million instead of 360. That's one way to look at it, I guess. So that's the only introductory slides that I had was just a recap on receipts. If there's no questions on that, I'm going to start through the taxes. Okay. Dr. Thomas Jones is going to start with the individual income tax. Thomas, do you want the mouse? Yeah.
Thank you. I guess it's not going to work for me. Oh, well, no. There we go. Okay. I get to be a little more optimistic. You heard from Michael, you heard a little bit increase, a little bit decrease, and you heard across
when Greg spoke a moment ago, some of the taxes are up and some of them are down. Individual income tax has been largely optimistic compared to September to now. The control is more optimistic than it was in September, and each of the scenarios is more optimistic than September. And the receipts that we received in the last quarter were positive. They were, that is, not only were they positive, but they were larger than we had expected in September. So I get to be a little more optimistic. I feel like in the last several presentations that I've given that I've been pessimistic in several of my presentations. I finally get to be optimistic in this one. And as one of the largest taxes, individual income tax, being positive and optimistic is a good thing. So here you can see the individual accounts for the last few years, and I've also presented the first quarter of receipts. All of the accounts grew in the first quarter except for PTE, which was expected. The total individual income tax account grew by 7.2% in the first quarter. That's an $89 million increase over the same quarter last year. Withholding made up the great majority of that $89 million. It increased by 7.5% in the first quarter of fiscal 26. That's an $81 million increase over the first quarter of 25. Declarations grew 22% compared to the same quarter last year. That's an increase of $16 million from the same quarter last year. Net returns increased its position. It grew $29 million compared to last year. Fiduciary grew an astounding 2.5%. Now remember, fiduciary is usually negative throughout the year, so an increase in the first quarter of the fiscal year is a difference from history. So an increase of $2.4 million is a very large amount for fiduciary. The pass-through entity tax, it fell by 32%. That was anticipated because in fiscal 26, we're no longer receiving 3 different years of taxpayer filings. In 25, taxpayers were paying on 23, 24, and 25. And now in 26, we're down to where taxpayers are only paying on their current fiscal year. This is the methodology for the withholding. It's exactly the same as I presented in September, and it's the same methodology that I've been using for quite a long time. Oh, again, 90% of tax mod adjustments are put into withholding, and 10% are in declarations. And here's the methodology for the other components of the individual income tax. Everything here is the same as I presented in September, except for one tiny adjustment I made to net returns. I made a in-model seasonal dummies for correcting for seasonality. In the past, I've never corrected for seasonality. It's very difficult to correct for seasonality when all of your observations are negative numbers. So I made an attempt at correcting for seasonality using seasonal dummies, and I think it did a very good job of correcting for the seasonality. It might have picked up some other cyclical behavior, but I'm not making any comments about the coefficients for those terms, so it's perfectly fine, but it did a good job of correcting the seasonality. So here's the withholding forecast. You'll see that for FY26, there's no meaningful difference between the 3 scenarios. And this is largely because the MAC model relies on, or I should say, the withholding model relies on Kentucky wages and salary for its main driver, and the Kentucky wages and salary variable relies on U.S. wages and salary for its main driver. And it's because the scenarios for those 3 scenarios in U.S. wages and salary were very similar, it flows through and we get withholding having very similar results for all 3 scenarios. In FY28, you can see in FY26 the growth rates are 2.0% for all 3 scenarios, and all the way out in fiscal 28, the difference between pessimistic and optimistic is $111 million. So let's just focus on withholding growth for a moment. You can see there in the first quarter, that's actual 7.5% growth rates, and then the other 3 are forecasted growth rates. And you can see in the first 2 quarters, that's the old regime of the tax rates, and in fiscal 26, the second half, that is the new 3.5% that goes into effect on January the 1st. So you can see the effects of tax mod are pretty severe in dropping the growth rates into negative territory in the second half of the fiscal year. And as I mentioned, the pass-through entity tax is the only tax in the first quarter that declined, and that was expected. And it's, as I said, it's largely a result of the loss of taxpayers paying for 3 different fiscal years of tax years of payments, and now they're only down to paying for the current tax year alone. So there in fiscal 26, you can see a net result of minus 25.3% is what I'm forecasting for just fiscal 26, and I've got constants for the next 2 years. And for declarations, this is a simple ARIMA model with 10% of tax mod. As a rule of thumb, declarations is 1/3 of declarations comes in the first half of the fiscal year, and 2/3 of declarations comes in the second half of the year. So we're still in the small declarations section of the fiscal year. Net returns is a simple moving 3-quarter moving average model corrected for seasonality. My best effort to correct for seasonality, and you can see that the declines dampen in fiscal 26 and remain relatively constant in 27 and 28. The fiduciary forecast, it's moderated and tapering in the fiscal years. This is a MA3 model with fiscal 24 observations removed. In fiscal 24, there were some anomalies. We had lots of, we issued lots of refunds that were based on prior fiscal years that had nothing to do, prior tax years that had nothing to do with 24 at all. And so I removed the fiscal 24 observations from the moving average period. So for any of the observations that included a fiscal 24 time period, I removed those, and it really just kind of reduced to an MA2 model for those observations. But you can see very little difference from September. And here's all 5 components aggregated together. You can see there's very little difference across the 3 scenarios for fiscal 26. 1.2%, 2.6%, and 2.5% growth rates for the control. That's $138 million than more optimistic than what we presented in September for all of individual. So let's take a look at the $138 million difference from last year, from last presentation. So there's the $138 million for fiscal 26, and the difference is $152 million for fiscal 27, and $130 million more optimistic than September for fiscal 28. And now I want to take a closer look at that $138 million and see where the pieces come from. Whoops, I think I changed the order of my slides. So let's take a look at the September versus December withholding first. This is a comparison between September and December for just the withholding, and it's a pretty uniform shift across all 3 years. Withholding is essentially flat from fiscal 25 to 26. That's why I included the fiscal 25 there, so you could see the growth, or the lack of growth from 25 to 26. That's a decrease of $10.2 million. In the December model, I have withholding going up by $90.9 million for fiscal 26. And this is entirely due to S&P Global's more optimistic forecast for the U.S. wages and salary, which flows through to Kentucky wages and salary. And now I can talk about the $138 million for the fiscal 26. You can see that the majority of that increase is in withholding. $101 million of the $138 million is in withholding, and $46 million is in declarations. And then the other 3 accounts are have small changes. But overall, an optimistic improvement for 26. Oops, I'm going to leave it on that. Let me go back, Greg.
I don't care.
Just 1 second. That's all I have for individual income tax. Do you have any questions? I covered a lot of ground in a short period of time.
All right, sales tax is back to me. Here we are. Oh, I can see much better without my glasses. One good thing about a December forecast, coming off a September forecast, is you can actually look at that first quarter and see how your model did. And so I did that. I went in and looked at what I projected, looked at what came in. You may recall my comments on September receipts. We had 3.9% growth in September. The model underestimated that by $38.6 million. So right away, I knew my model was shooting a little bit low. So I took heed of that and have some possible explanations for why it did shoot a little bit low. The December estimates are higher in all three scenarios. Make no mistake. Not as much higher as one would expect with a $38.6 million miss in one quarter. There's two major changes between what we did in September and what we're doing now. And I don't want to repeat what others have said, but we have an extra quarter of data and we have a new econometric forecast. The exogenous variables for the sales tax, while there were some, Michael presented a lot of variables that had some fairly wild swings to them, but the variables in the sales tax are not those variables. They're kind of, I guess, due to lack of federal offices being open and stuff. The structural models, I saved the structural models from my working file from September, and I have the structural models from my working file in December. I plotted them, and they're right on top of each other. So I'm thinking that most of the $38.6 million error was not necessarily due to the extra quarter of data. So that leaves not much of the change was due to the econometric forecast. So that left me with the extra quarter of data. And one thing I did just for fun to see what the effect of the extra quarter of data might be was I ran my ARIMA model like I always do in December. I ran my ARIMA model. I kept my results from the ARIMA model in September. I plotted the two, looked at the difference, and my working conclusion was that the extra quarter of historical data was more important to the forecast than the new econometric forecast. And let me just plot or show you the plot. This is the difference in the ARIMA model. I talked to Thomas about this slide yesterday. It's a little bit misleading in that I don't. In the blue line, which is the December forecast, that uptick that you see when the line split, that first uptick is historical. That's not a forecasted variable. That's historical. So it should be black if you want to look at it that way. That should be a black number. So the ARIMA forecast in September thought that the September quarter was going to go down, and it actually went up. So the ARIMA model undershot was responsible for most of the $38.6 million. You can see that that the ARIMA models don't diverge wildly. Sometimes on a REMA model, you tend to get your last quarter of data tends to dictate the direction of your REMA model. My specification is not as prone to that as other specifications. So really you get kind of parallel lines at a higher level on the ARIMA model. So the time series components of my blending is going to be the major difference for why the forecast is more optimistic in December than it was in September. Not going to go into the model specifications because they are almost identical to what we did. The only thing that did change a little bit, the ARIMA model specification, oddly enough, normally you're going to get it to change just a little bit when you add a quarter of data. It didn't change. So I've got the same ARIMA model. I use the same structural time series model. On the VAR, I use the same variables, but on a VAR, you're looking at lagged variables for your two dependent variables. My two dependent variables are sales and Kentucky wages and salaries. And the cross terms that got selected, the lags, that, if you will, were a little bit different. So that's the only difference in the VAR, was that the like on the sales tax equation, which is the one I care about, used different lags from Kentucky wages and salaries than it did in the prior version. And you can see the variables in the structural models. The income variable that I use is not wages and salaries, and you may recall Michael, when he put up wages and salaries, there were some big variation, but when you look at Kentucky personal income, there wasn't as much fluctuation in Kentucky personal income, so the structural models really didn't change too much. This is, these are the three structural models that we did for control, optimistic, pessimistic. Of course, each of those is a blended model. I have two structural models, so each of those are blends of two structural models. So there's a total of 6 models, but that's how they came out. The funny thing was, at least funny to me, was that when I was doing the blend for the control, this has really never kind of happened, but the ARIMA model, the VAR, and the structural model, when I went to blend them, they were all just about the same. So the blending didn't make much difference in the sales tax models, because there was very little variation between the three. Usually I get, the time series models will perform a little bit different than the structural models, but this time there's very little variation between time series models and structural models. I apologize. I broke my rule that I set. The top line is blue, which is supposed to be control, but it's really optimistic if you look at the legend. And the green line is green, which is usually optimistic, but it's control in this one. It's just a quirk of how my econometric software plots. So I apologize for that. But these are your scenarios for December, the sales tax scenarios. I already showed you the structural models. these are the sales tax scenarios I'm presenting for the month of December, for the official estimates. Here's just another display of that. It shows control, optimistic, pessimistic, and the growth rates. A lot of numbers on the page, so I'm going to show some different displays that may be easier to discern the differences. This is probably not the easier one to discern the differences because it just has it's just a straight text of what were the September and December numbers for each of the three scenarios. I think the easier one to digest the differences between September and December are this one. And I apologize, this is just control. I could have easily done optimistic and pessimistic and got similar type of differences, but you can see that the difference is about 76.8 in the current year, 73.7 in the second year, and oddly enough, the fiscal 28 had the smallest difference from what we did in September, which was a puzzling result to me. And I looked into that and to make sure there were no errors, and there's no errors. That's the way the models kicked out. So 76.8% improvement over September, 73.7% improvement over September for the sales tax, and a 32.3% improvement over September for fiscal 28. I'm sorry. Thank you, Thomas. Those are millions of dollars. They're not percents. I beg your pardon. I didn't read my own title. Millions of dollars nominal. So thank you. And I think that concludes the prepared remarks I had for the sales tax. If there's any questions, I'll be happy to address them.
I know you've been doing this a long time, but I'm going to go back to your memory. When we have a recession, what usually happens, like round numbers, like what happens to sales and use tax in Kentucky? I mean, if we have a recession of some kind in the past, and I know it's been a long time, especially if we don't count the COVID recession or something, it's been a long time. But I mean, do sales and use, are they basically flat because people are spending things no matter what? Or if we have a recession, do the sales and use tax go down considerably?
Well, we had minor little recessions in 2015 and the Great Recession, 2007, 2008, 2009, that area. What happened in the sales tax was it held up pretty well, longer than the other variables. It held up a little bit, but it was slow to recover. It was slow to jump out of the recession, but it was a sort of a jobless, spendless recovery. If you remember, we call it the jobless recovery, and it was also kind of a spending lagged recovery. Held up longer in the beginning, slower to recover.
The reason I ask, thank you. So the reason I ask is like looking at the general fund forecast that you put up here for the next couple of years. I know you just put up control, but I looked at the difference between optimistic and pessimistic.
Yeah.
And again, just back to how optimistic S&P Global is or how pessimistic they are is I think what we'll probably be talking about later. The sales and use taxes for fiscal year 26 between optimistic and pessimistic was only 1% different. It was only 3% different in fiscal year 27, and it was 4% difference in fiscal year 28. And so that's from the models that we have here. So does that sound right in your head that between the optimistic, because maybe the S&P Global has given us such a tight band that the small difference between those two makes sense in the sales and use tax?
yes, and I will say that sometimes I do quirky blending on the sales tax models when it comes to control optimistic pessimistic. I didn't disclose any blending because I didn't do any like double weighted VAR, double weighted ARIMA. I didn't do any of that. So it's strictly, as you said, indicative of what Global Insight's saying.
Because that's helpful to me, because for the individual income, the difference between optimistic and pessimistic for fiscal year 26-27 is 0. So that's why I asked the question of Michael earlier. So our models have that the individual income, whether we're in a pessimistic or optimistic, that we're going to get basically the exact same dollar amounts for fiscal year 26 and fiscal year 27. And I think there's a 2% difference in fiscal year 28. So that's why I was just wondering, just generally, since, as you said, those two big ones are like 75% of the big number, is one of them is basically saying there's no difference whether we're in a pessimistic or optimistic, and the sales tax is just a little. So I'm just trying to make sure that we all agree that's like where the numbers are going.
Thank you. I'm ready to turn it over to major business taxes, but I hit something on the computer here that brought up a browser. Let me see if I can. There we go. Gene, it's all yours. Gene Zapranic Brown here.
Thank you. So if we're going to look at what's different between the September forecast and the current forecast, we have two different things going on. On the positive side, the S&P forecast for profits is higher than it was in September, which would indicate we would have higher receipts. On the negative side, it's what we've seen in our monthly receipts and year-to-date. As Greg mentioned, in October, the receipts were $118 million less than last year. Now, that did account $80 million of that was the one-time money. November receipts were down only $8 million, but that was on a base of $40 million. So it was a small month, but we still had a significant decline. It's nearly 20%. And then I looked yesterday and what we're doing so far in December. Now, it's always difficult to look in the middle of the month and see how we're tracking on receipts. Last December, we brought in $291 million. Yesterday through the 15th, last year we had collected $92 million. So far this year, we've collected $20 million. So it's not a guarantee that we're going to be down again, but December is a significant month, and through the first half of the month, we're still well behind what we did last year. We talk a lot about the $300 million in one-time money. Even when you take that out, we're down 13% in the major business taxes through November. So, we have we have, something that would tend to increase our receipts, and then on the negative side is the year-to-date receipts. I will say I did make an out-of-model adjustment for the difference between the $118 million and the $80 million. So the $38 million, I made an out-of-model adjustment for that because that's money that's already in the bank, and I did the same for November. So if we look at the Global Insight profits forecast, you can see the difference. It's significantly higher than it was in September. And this is the current forecast, the three scenarios. The control is fairly flat, while the optimistic is higher and the pessimistic is lower, and there's still not a lot of change through the forecast period. There it is. So in terms of the changes to the forecasts, you can look on the bottom between September and the current forecast. $55 to $90 million decrease in the current year. Small increases and a small decrease in 27, and not much change in 28.
Just a quick question. I think, hey, on the way over this morning, I was listening to different business radio discussions. They were discussing, I believe, a New York Times story, which I've not seen. But, and what I don't know is, well, the story is basically about the change in federal tax laws for depreciation for corporations, much faster tax depreciation. And so I don't know, and maybe you discussed it in September, unfortunately I was not here. Has Kentucky changed at all their corporate depreciation tax rates or tax depreciation rates to reflect more of the federal approach? Because basically it's a shifting, right? I'm going to get more deductions this year as a corporations, fewer in the outer years because of the depreciation still going to be the same. It's just when the timing is, which affects your tax payments. Correct. Which in book purposes will normalize all that for accounting purposes. So I'm assuming this corporate profits is a normalized number, not a cash number. So so it's two questions. One, does that depreciation affect some of the timing of these things? And two, how is Kentucky's tax code reflect, if at all, the change of the federal code?
It's good questions. Do you happen to?
Well, recently, the Kentucky General Assembly has been doing code updates during their tax bills, their major tax bills each session. Sometimes the code updates exclude very expensive provisions, like that would be a fairly expensive provision to enact for Kentucky.
At least in the short run, right?
So I am not sure that I'm sure that we did a code update. I'm not sure that we updated that part of the code. That I apologize. I'm just not sure whether we did that. But
The reason I asked that, because you were talking about cash collections, which again, at the federal level, they're collecting less cash from corporations this year, which will reverse itself in outer years. But I didn't know if maybe that was a reason. I was just speculating. So thank you.
Sometimes it reacts, sometimes it doesn't.
There's not much to talk about in the property tax. Typically, I don't make any changes in it just because we don't have enough information this time of year. The majority of the money comes in through the larger accounts. The real collection, the tangible, that's typically, we see collections beginning in October and November and ending in January and February. And we just don't have enough information. But I did make changes this time to 3 accounts. Initially, I was just going to look at the motor vehicle. That does come in every month, so it's pretty consistent throughout the year. And then while I was looking at that, I looked at the tangible account and then the other account. So the total changes across the 3 years. There's just a single forecast. I don't have alternatives. So that ranged from a change of $4 million to $5.5 million. And most of that was in the motor vehicle account, and that was based on year-to-date collections, so a change of 3.2. I reduced these 3.2 million in 26, 3.9 million in 27, and 4.1 million in 28. These are the forecasts. So essentially, very small changes, $4 to $5 million, the majority of it in the motor vehicle account. So essentially, no change in the property tax.
I think we bounced out of the. We're gonna have to jump ahead a little bit. Technical glitch here. I'll get us caught up. Mr. Chairman, there's about 12 to 13 minutes left in the general fund. Do you want to plow through or do you need a break? All right, the cigarette tax, very little change. Just a reminder, that tax has been in a free fall since the rate changed in fiscal 19. We held up for 1 year, and there's just been a steady, a healthy, steady stream down. The new forecast changed ever so slightly. You can see September and December. December's in a bold red font for some reason, and the September numbers. So you can see very small differences in the cigarette tax forecast. This is one tax that I apologize. On the spreadsheet that I sent you, I had a control, optimistic, and pessimistic forecast in the spreadsheets I sent you. I've changed the spreadsheet that we're going to present today to eliminate the control, optimistic, and pessimistic scenarios for the cigarette tax because they were very little difference, very difficult to explain, and really I didn't feel comfortable doing to presenting those models. So it's just a control, and the spreadsheets have been changed by $1 million or something for the cigarette tax. So very little change, continues to go down. Percent changes are between 7 and 9.9%. We had a good November, so this fiscal year so far, we're doing pretty well, but cigarette tax receipts are so lumpy that I didn't want to build any of the November. We had a great month in November. I didn't want to build any of that in because, you get a 20% month that goes up and the next month will be nothing because it's not based on retail cigarette purchases. It's based on stamp purchases by stamping agents. So it doesn't have anything to do with the purchase of cigarettes. It's the purchase of stamps to pay your tax. Kentucky Lottery. This is a recap of fiscal 25. I just want to point out a couple things. We talked about some of this, but fiscal 25 growth in sales, good, which is good for last year. So that's the base coming into this year. Unfortunately, our two profitable revenue sources, Scratch was down 2.8%, and draw games, which are like Pick 3, Pick 4, Mega Millions, Powerball, were down 15.1%, and the sales growth actually came from iLottery, Instant Play, and that was up 25.8%. Problem with that is it's far and away the lowest profit margin of any lottery offering. So even though sales are up, they're down in the two games that are most influential to the bottom line of the Kentucky Lottery. We in the forecast that we presented in September was 370, 370, 370. We lowered 27 and 28 to 365. The reason we did that was scratch tickets. Since we met in September, the scratch products have really softened quite a bit, down 8.9% year to date. 8.9% year to date is a significant decline in scratch products. the online games have not done bad year to date, but we've had two big jackpots year to date. We had a big Mega Millions jackpot. Powerball was running recently, but we had a $1.8 billion Powerball in earlier this fiscal year, and those two games have proven very jackpot dependent. So if you don't have a big jackpot, those games are not turning the tickets. So we decided to lower. There's a group that I get with when we do the lottery forecast. Ellen Hessen, Maggie Garrison, and Mr. Mudd. I can't remember his first name. I apologize about that. But we get together, we talk it over, we push each other back and forth, and we decided to lower 27 and 28 to 365. That's the difference in the forecast and the lottery.
Greg, I had just maybe an aside question. So you talk about the iLottery being the biggest growth. Is there a compelling reason why the profit margins are much less for those? I mean, they set the payout rates, I'm assuming. Like
They do.
And so I'm just curious, is it a market pressure, or is it what's going on with that makes it so very different than a particular scratch-offs?
That's a good question. The answer is the Kentucky Lottery Corporation is determined that level of return to players is profit maximizing. If you lower the return to players, your play falls off significantly. They have some economists and they have a lot of accountants, and they've determined that to be the profit maximizing return to players. We're not trying to maximize sales. We're trying to maximize the dividend to the Commonwealth, and that's the level that they've determined maximizes the dividend to the Commonwealth.
Okay.
I know that's a weak answer, but
Well, no, I mean, I believe the economists, and yeah, it's just for the nature of the game and how often you have to win, and so it was just a curiosity.
yeah, thank you. All right, that leads us to the other miscellaneous taxes. Lottery's not a miscellaneous taxes. It's on the big board. So were cigarettes. These are the other taxes that are shown at the bottom of the spreadsheet. 60 accounts not otherwise classified. I've moved coal and all the extraction taxes into other due to falling levels. You can see the 5 largest accounts, and most of these accounts are estimated with annual data, not quarterly data or monthly data, due to irregular collection cycles. Just to give you some idea of size of some of these accounts, you can see that recently the income on investments has been a fast grower and a big nominal amount, $323 million in fiscal 25. The next largest is insurance premiums at 239.2 million. So, and they go down from there. But those are the largest accounts and the approximate amount they bring in. You can see at the bottom that the remaining 55 accounts that are not listed collectively bring in about $106 million. So we're catching the big ones up at the top there.
Greg,
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I understand. Income on investments, and is this reported on individual income tax, or this is not report? This is the ones
Entirely separate from individual.
totally separate. Okay.
Yeah, this is, we had those we've developed quite a rainy day fund because back in 21, 22, 23, we had some underestimations in revenue and had billion-dollar surpluses, and those are in the investment pool now,
Okay,
in the short-term pool, which,
just making sure.
given the inverted yield curve, is actually bringing in more than the intermediate pool.
Ah.
So that's what that is. Speaking of investments, since it is one of the larger other income sources, I want to acknowledge the Office of Financial Management. In particular, there's one lady that helped me quite a bit, Amber Lee, and Steve Starkweather, and Daniel. I'm sorry? Oxier. I have trouble pronouncing his last name, but he's very helpful, very knowledgeable man, and he was very helpful in getting the new investment forecast. Again, the dramatic increase stems from prior year surpluses that were deposited into the rainy day fund. And as I already mentioned, the short-term pool has benefited, and that's where this is invested. It's a short-term pool. They have a short-term pool, an intermediate pool, and just a transactional account that has lower interest rates. But the inverted yield curve has really helped the yields on the short-term pool, which is where the rainy day fund sits, most of it. The new forecast is considerably lower than the forecast that we presented in September. The forecast we presented in September was a different type of forecast than what I'm presenting in December. The forecast that I presented in September was not so much a figuring out exact balances at different dates and figuring out what the interest rates were at those dates, multiplying the two together and coming up with a sort of a micro-based view of income on investments. It was more of a look at the receipts, forecast the receipts type forecast, and look at year to date, what we've had in the last 12 months, what we think it's going to go down each month. And it was a more naive forecast based on actual receipts from the lottery and what kind of declines would be needed to hit certain levels. This is actually a forecast from a giant spreadsheet that has interest rates and projected balances. I've got a couple notes on this, just a second. Basically, the reason that the forecast has gone down is that the sort of the peak of the rainy day fund was about 5.2 billion. We spent down about 3.1, and then we appropriated about 1.1. So the new balance, if everything goes according to the spending plans that they had, would be about 3.2 million. So the forecast last time, which is on the next slide, but it was 260, 240, 220. And you can see we're quite a bit below that. And that's based on the projected spend down of the balance. Let me get to that next slide. Yeah, this is the difference between the forecast, and there was a difference in methodology, and there was also a recognition of the of the of Hospital One and the projected spend down that was we appropriated some money, and then we appropriated money to be put back. But the putback was a little bit smaller than the appropriated amount, so balances are falling, and the forecast is falling. So that's the biggest change to other taxes is the income on investments. This is the complete. I don't want to go into all the other taxes that they're. I presented the control on this slide because we do have a control, an optimistic and a pessimistic for other. The changes are minor because the only real taxes with alternative scenarios are extraction taxes, and the changes are minimal. I used to do other forecasts for some of the bigger variables like alcohol taxes and but without a global without a quarterly model with a global insight, S&P global variable or something that has a control optimistic pessimistic scenario, it's very difficult to produce a meaningful control optimistic pessimistic without being sort of ad hocery about it. So we've limited the number of alternative forecasts in the other, and I presented here the forecasts that we're going to present for other when we put up the spreadsheets. You'll notice that most of these numbers are below what we presented in October, and that's mainly because of the change in investment. We did move the coal severance tax into other, and I'm going to yield to Dr. Thomas Jones to go through the coal part of extraction taxes.
This will be brief. So this is the exact same model specification that I used in September. Go forward one. Here you can see the results of the model. Compared to last year, coal prices are up a little bit. Last year in November, coal prices were, Central Appalachian coal was selling for $75 a ton, and currently they're at $81 per ton. So it's gone up a little bit. And also severed tons has also increased a little bit in the last couple of quarters. I don't get too excited about that because we're still near historical all-time lows in severed tons. Last quarter, we severed 7 million tons in the entire state for the whole quarter. I feel really old. When I first started doing this 25 years ago, one county in 1 month was severing over 7 million tons. So we've fallen quite a long ways. 5 quarters ago was the all-time low for severed tons, 4.5 million severed tons in the quarter, and we're currently at 7 million severed tons for the quarter. So we're still near the all-time low in severed tons, but we did tick up a little bit. We grew by 14% in the last quarter. So it's still an improvement. So tons increased a little bit, prices increased by a little bit. The coal forecast is increased by a little bit relative to calendar 25. That's all.
To wrap up the general fund, I just had a few comparison slides I was going to put up. These are the percentage growth in all scenarios. Notice that fiscal 26, whatever option you choose, if you're bounded by pessimistic and optimistic, you're going to have a negative growth forecast in 26. Kind of a tight cluster in 27. Pessimistic at 1.5, optimistic at 3, and an even tighter band in fiscal 28, 1.8 to 2.8. So a 1% difference in 28. It never ceases to amaze me that Michael puts up some economic variables that have, some of them have some pretty fairly wild swings, in between scenarios, optimistic, pessimistic, and control. Yet the revenue forecast are a little bit more stable. And I'll look at the two biggest taxes just real quickly. Individual income tax, variable from the MAC model, Kentucky wages and salaries. That does not have much variation between control, optimistic, pessimistic. And as I reported on the sales tax, not a lot of difference on the structural models for the sales tax either. Those are variables that did not show a lot of variation when Michael put them up. So these are the percentage growth for all scenarios. This is the implied variation in dollar terms between the scenarios. It's a $151 million swing in fiscal 26, a $377.6 million swing in 27, and a $538 million swing in fiscal 28, which may seem mild, but in the budget world, those are big swings. So those are the implied variation among the scenarios. And there's only a few taxes that contribute to the alternative scenarios. The individual income tax, as Thomas reported, sales and use, major business taxes, other taxes, just in the fact that severance taxes, but there's no meaningful alternative scenario for the remaining revenue sources. As I said, the periodicity of the underlying data is not always a neat quarter. Even if you seasonally adjust or put seasonal dummies in, they don't fit themselves well to S&P Global variables. So there's no meaningful alternative scenarios for the remaining variables. So with that, we typically put up the spreadsheets and come to a consensus, but would you like to break before we do that?
Yes, but could I ask one quick question before we break, just
Yeah.
in case you have to go look it up? Can you remind me of what our official forecast for fiscal year 26 was prior to our revision in September?
It's on the spreadsheet, and I'll show that. I don't have to look
Okay.
it up, but
It's not on the.
yeah, I added a tab
Okay.
to the spreadsheet for
That,
that
great,
very
as
reason.
long as we can look at it. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
And then yes, I propose we have a break.
Yeah, so there's a break. Is it?
Yeah, that'd be fine.
Oh, cool. Excellent.
Yep.
Hey, Greg. Greg, on your last slide, the numbers that you have on the screen and the numbers that are in the book were different.
I know.
But you didn't tell them that.
I didn't tell him that because I forgot.
is everybody ready to resume?
Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, this is the spreadsheet we're typically used to looking at. General fund blend for December 2025, and you usually have a robust discussion, and then we start playing with some blends if that's appropriate. But I yield back to you guys for discussion, and then. I did get one answer to a question during the break. And that's the depreciation question that you asked, David. We did a code update, but we're on a completely different depreciation schedule than the feds. So even though we did a code update, it has no impact on the depreciation schedules in Kentucky because we've decoupled from that for a long time and haven't, and we have our own statutes and our own practices on depreciation. Okay. Now I guess the floor is yours, sir.
All right, Chris, you have.
Hey, did you get can you tell me what that forecast for fiscal year 26 for the general fund was prior to our revision in September?
Yeah. The enacted number was 15,654.9 million.
Say that's 654.9. Okay.
I don't know if that's what you're asking for. Was that the number? That was the number after the September meeting or before, like in August before we met? I think he's asking for August.
Yeah, that's what I'm at. What I'm asking for is what our forecasts 2 years ago for fiscal year 26 was that we revised in September.
Well, the
which may be that.
Well, in September,
Correct.
We came up with an estimate 15,349.7.
Yes.
Which compared to what was in the budget. Now, what you did 2 years ago has been amended several times.
Thank you. Yes.
And that left a $305.2 million hole in the enacted budget.
Okay.
And then
enacted one is the one we did probably in December before the session 2 years ago.
Yeah.
It's a close.
as amended by acts of the General Assembly.
Does anybody see a reason not to go with the control on this one? What about this end of the room?
I think we weighed it differently.
Well, I'm good with control. My only question when I look at the numbers is how confident are we in the corporate and LLT value? Because everything else kind of makes a lot of sense to me. But that's the one that has year over year a huge change. And if we aren't, we don't talk about confidence intervals here, but that number in my mind is the key to the overall number level. Because pessimistic or optimistic or control doesn't matter as much as how confident we are about that number.
Yeah.
How confident am I in that? Well, when you look at it, we've collected $350 million so far. So we've got about $1 billion more to go. We have several big months. We are down 13% so far. I'm not super confident, I would say. I don't see anything where this is going to increase. I mean, the S&P forecast has those profits increasing. That's not what we're seeing so far in receipts. Other states are not seeing the same thing. They're seeing kind of the same thing that we are, declining receipts. Not all states, but the majority of the states.
So if the lottery created an over-under game on that, we'd see more unders than overs, you think? Okay, that's helpful. So with that, I'm good with control.
But in
I think
terms of the-
overall, I think there's kind of pessimistic in the longer term. It's, as you point out, there's not a lot of difference in the different scenarios, particularly in the shorter term.
Yeah, I was about to say, probably just like in September, I'm slightly pessimistic because I think you and I are on the opposite ends. I don't think a 2-month recession over the next 2.5 years is overly pessimistic in my mind. Today, this morning, the unemployment rate, only one number, jumped to 4.6% at today's notice, which is already close to what the control has us through for like the next year or two. And so if the rest of the group is okay with control, I think I am. I mean, even if we did like a blend of control and pessimistic of like 50 and 50, the numbers still go up higher than what we had in September. So, I mean, I don't know. Unfortunately, I think our windows, our estimates are so close together, I'm not sure it makes a big difference if we go with the estimates as they're currently constructed with the MAC model and so on. So if the rest of the group is okay with control, I think we're going to, I hope we stay at control, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was only going to say this about the fiscal year 26 estimate, but as I've thought about it, and I don't want to make us talk too long. So our current estimate that we're using is based on, I'm going to go with limited data changes. Or in other words, we don't have a lot of the data that we usually would in December. We had all the data that we usually would in September. So why do we think our forecast now is better than our forecast was in September? I was especially going to make that argument with respect to fiscal year 26. Currently, fiscal year 26 revenues overall are about spot on with where they should be, and we could decline about 3.8% per year slide for the rest of the year in collections. I don't know what's going to happen, but if we really are going to have a little recession here in these next 2 months, the receipts are going to decline. How much room do we want to give in the budget for them to come in as a shortfall? Do we really want to change from when we had good data to when we have kind of a hole?
I guess it is a question on how many is it better? Is it systematically worse data that they have? Like it's different data they're using, but were they using one type of data relative to another source that they weren't consistently using? Sometimes a shock will change your methodology, and it's not necessarily that it's going to deteriorate it, right? It may have been they've been using the same system. It's not clear to me the data is that much bad. I mean, maybe I'm missing something.
And I guess my other observation, because I did this math, is through November for the individual income tax, I think we're 195 up year over year. And if you look at the forecast, we're only supposed to be 63.6 up year over year. Now, part of that's going to be the change in tax rate, right, from 4 to 3.5 for the balance of the year. I don't know that number, but so that gave me comfort that we're kind of a little bit ahead going into the last half of the fiscal year. And similarly on the sales and use tax, we're forecasting a $226 million increase year over year, and I think we already have, I did the math right, about $144 million in the books, and that won't suffer from a rate change. So, and we talked earlier about even if we had a recession, income is gonna kind of stay similar, and so people will still be consuming. So I got to your point, I got comfortable. And my other observation, I mentioned it earlier today, is when I was looking at index of leading economic indicators yesterday, consumer sentiment was clearly the most negative thing out there on the overall index.
Yeah.
And so that's something that can change pretty quickly. I'm not saying it will, but so that's my other observation, is that they weren't signaling just yet. They're on the edge of a recession signal, but they haven't gone there yet. So
Okay.
I'm fine with control.
It sounds like the consensus for December 16th, anyway, is consensus.
you imply if we met tomorrow, we'd have a different.
Well, one never knows.
You need that.
knows.
You need
One
that
never
Truman
knows.
one-arm economist, right?
Yeah.
All right, if consensus is the choice, I'm sorry, if control is the choice, I need to go through a little math here real quick. That would make the December estimate for fiscal 26, 15,498.9 million. For fiscal 27, it would be 15,882.0 million, and for fiscal 28, 16,232.2 million. And the other piece of housekeeping I need to do is to show the effect this has on the budget. So what we have on top is the new December control estimate, and then we have the control estimate from September, and you can see that there's improvement there. But as Dr. Bollinger asked, what is that? How does that compare to the enacted budget? The budget hole that we changed official estimates in the September meeting to find out what the budget hole was, so we can make appropriate actions to the budget. At that time, the hole, if you compare September to the enacted, the hole was $305.2 million. So we've been working towards that end. With today's control estimate, the new difference between what we're saying today, the official estimate for the biennium, and what the enacted number is 156.0 million. So we're still calling for a shortfall compared to the enacted budget, but this little line over here that says better off, we're $149.2 million better off budget-wise than we were when we kicked back on September. All right. Is there anything else to cover on this, or should we go to the road fund? On to the road fund.
Can you do, I think it's F5.
Yes, sir. I think it's shift F5.
Okay.
There, so you don't have to scroll back through all the
Okay.
slides.
So in terms of a summary of the changes to the forecast, the control and optimistic are fairly similar, to where we see a $30 to $50 million increase compared to September over all 3 years. Those increases are going to be in the usage and the fuels. It's not surprising. Those are by far the two biggest accounts. They make up about 85% of the total road fund. The pessimistic is essentially unchanged in the first 2 years, but about a $20 million increase in fiscal 28. In the pessimistic, we have decline in usage over all 3 years, but the fuels increases. So in terms of what we'll look at, we'll spend the majority of the time looking at the usage and fuels, and then just a quick comment on the other accounts that changed had very small changes. So these are the differences that I spoke about. You can see the control and optimistic very similar in terms of increases in those 3 years, and the pessimistic small changes in the first 2 years and a bigger change in the third year. And even though these changes, these really aren't very big in terms of percentage of the total. These are very small changes. So in terms of the motor fuels forecast, of course, the rate is unchanged tax rate's unchanged for the current year because that's already set. That was based on the average wholesale price last fiscal year. But it's also going to be the same in fiscal 27 across all 3 scenarios. And in fiscal 28, that tax rate is going to be higher. In terms of the forecast, I use consumption of fuels, and that has increased relative to the September forecast under all 3 scenarios. So this is the retail price of gasoline under the current forecast. I use this to calculate the average wholesale price, which gives us the tax rate. You can see that the blue line is the December forecast. The red line is the September forecast. It's higher in 25 and 26. It's about even into the middle of 27, and then lower in 28. And I've highlighted the fiscal 27 piece where you can see in the first half of the year the forecast is higher now. That's what leads us to the increase in the tax rate in 28. The 28 tax rate's based on the average wholesale price in 27. I did mention, if you look to the left of the highlighted area, that the forecast is higher than it was in September, and I said and that's what determines the 27 tax rate. And if you recall, I mentioned that the tax rate was unchanged from September. You may wonder how it's unchanged if the price of gasoline, which is used to calculate the average wholesale price, is higher. It's unchanged because in the first quarter, I overestimated the average wholesale price for the first quarter. So it's actually lower. When you take that lower first quarter average wholesale price, it's the average of the 4 quarterly estimates. Even though they're higher in the 3 other quarters, the first quarter is low enough that on average for the year, it's unchanged. It's not exactly the same in terms of what the calculation is, but it rounds to the same tax rate. So just to reiterate, the tax rate for the current year, unchanged, 27 unchanged, higher in 28. Here's the consumption of fuels. This is the other part we use for the estimate. Again, the blue line is the December forecast. It's higher throughout the period compared to September. This is the current December forecast under the 3 scenarios, the control, optimistic, and pessimistic. So there is some variation. So here are the changes to the motor fuels estimates. Under the current year, not much difference. That's just based under all 3 scenarios. That's just based on the consumption of fuels. And you'll see this, it'll be the same thing in 27 because there's no change in the tax rate. We'll get a bigger change in 28 because we have a higher tax rate relative to what we were calling for in September, in addition to more consumption. So that's going to lead to the bigger increases in fiscal 28. In terms of the motor vehicle usage tax, again, the forecast is increased for all 3 years in the control and the optimistic scenarios. The pessimistic is lower than it was in September. And of course, that's based on consumer spending on light vehicles. Michael shows in his presentation, he looks at unit sales. I look at consumer spending on the vehicles. This is the comparison between consumer spending on light vehicles between December in September. And again, this December line is the blue line. This is the control scenario. It's higher throughout the entire period. This is the pessimistic. I wanted to go ahead and show that because under the pessimistic, you can see that in the current forecast compared to September, consumer spending on light vehicles is lower than it was in September. This is the December forecast for the three scenarios, and the pessimistic is much, much lower than the control and the optimistic. So in terms of the change in the vehicle, motor vehicle usage estimates, under the control scenario, $13 to $20 million over the 3-year period. A little higher in the optimistic in the first year, but moderate in the other 2 years, $10 to $17 million. And in the pessimistic, declines over all 3 years, $10 to $13 million. The weight distance forecast, I use an industrial production index of durable goods to forecast this. Even though the forecast of that index is higher than it was in September, the first quarter receipts were lower than what was forecasted by about $600,000. So the decline in the estimate for the first quarter receipts is going to outweigh the increase in that we get through the model. This is the change in that index. It looks like the decline is quite large, but if you look at the scale, it's really not too big. This is for the three scenarios. This is the December forecast, and again, the pessimistic drops down and is much lower than the control and the optimistic. So the change in the weight distance, I must have said that backwards. Anyway, they're increasing $2.5 million roughly for all scenarios over all 3 years. Looking at the remaining accounts, very small changes. The motor vehicle operators, the license, and the other are based on year-to-date receipts. The investment, much like Greg was talking about for the general fund, I take the forecast, the preliminary forecast for total road fund, send it over to the transportation cabinet. They have a model they use to determine what the investable balances might be. I, in turn, send that over to the finance cabinet and get interest rates. So the interest rates are going to be slightly lower, so that we'll have a small decline in the investment. And while the general fund brings in about $300 million in investment, the road fund is $9 to $10 million. So it's much, much smaller. So all these other accounts, very small changes, and on net, essentially no changes. So here's what we have for the road fund forecast under all the scenarios. Small declines in percentage terms this year. In 27, the control is going to be down again 0.4%, and then an increase in 28 to 4%. And that's the road fund forecast.
Can I ask a question? What, and you may have answered this, and I was thinking several different directions at the same time. What is the story behind the pessimistic forecast, given that there are changes in regulations that are coming up? Are those expected to have no impact or negative impact, you know, like on the number of EVs that need to be produced and those kinds of things?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what account we're looking at, but in terms of EVs in Kentucky, there aren't a lot. So I think any kind of regulatory issues wouldn't have a very big impact on whatever receipts we have.
So you wouldn't see more people driving because of, you know, lower energy costs or anything like that?
Well, I think most of the regulatory issues aren't they trying to reduce the number of EVs is what's happening right now.
Okay.
Um, but
Drop in consumer spending on light vehicles. In the pessimistic scenario, would that, I mean, the price of new vehicles is affected by tariffs, is that right? I mean, and so there's some sticker shock there. Is that what's going on in the pessimistic scenario? And I mean, but you've got the same sort of sticker shock in any of the scenarios. So
yeah, that's a good question. I think it's just the higher tariff rates under the pessimistic, and it's going to reduce the spending on light vehicles.
thanks.
Would you like me to pull up the spreadsheet? Or do you have more questions on the slides?
Yeah, pull it up. Yeah.
All right.
Show me the numbers, as Mark used to say.
And while he's doing that, Gene, so this big increase of 4% in fiscal year 28, so slightly negative in 26, slightly negative in 27, and then a big increase. Was that the same in September? Where we had, I mean, I'm showing that you show the total total road fund is going up 4% between fiscal year 28 and 27. Was that the same in September?
It would have been similar. I don't have that number. Relative to September, the control forecast is $52 million higher.
Right, so not much different. So what is the general reason for why we expect a big jump like 2 years from now? So we've got two straight negative numbers, right, percentage-wise, and then an increase of 4%?
So in fiscal 28, we've got the fuels going up 5%. We have an increase in the tax rate, and then usage tax is going up 3.7%.
Thank you.
That's the main, yeah.
That's one quick question. On the motor fuels, if I understand it, you're saying the tax rate's the same in fiscal 26 and 27, right?
Correct.
And so, and maybe you said this and I missed it. When I look at the change in dollars collected from 26 to 27, those go down, right, from 806.2 to 768.7. So that decline is due to the volume. Is that correct then?
Correct.
Just to make sure I didn't miss something else.
Correct. So can you go back to
Sure.
to this slide, the highway consumption of fuels?
Make sure
It's right there. So you can see the consumption falling fairly significantly over that time frame.
Right. Okay. All right, thanks.
I don't think it is, but I'd have to look off the top of my head. I just don't know.
Yeah, because the reason I focus on that is kind of like the equivalent to the corporate taxes in the general fund is, to your point, that takes us much lower than we've been since 22. And I agree there's been a long-term secular decline as fuel economies have improved and things like that for cars. So that's true for the U.S. as a whole. It's been a decline in consumption. But that sort of takes us sort of outside the range of the last 4 or 5 years, right? So it's just kind of the other low had been around 174 or something like that in terms of billions of barrels. So now we're down to 172. So I don't know how much that extra 2 billion barrels affects the dollars collected.
Are we ready to make a forecast here?
Yeah. Surprisingly early.
Yeah. So, who wants to lead off?
Well, I love consistency, so how about the control?
Yeah, I'm with you. I second that motion. Okay.
Yeah. I'm good with the overall numbers. I think I might have some different views on the mix, but it doesn't matter for the overall
Yeah.
numbers.
All right. So,
Okay.
okay. So, the consensus forecasting group has reached consensus, and we'll go with control on the road fund.
So to memorialize that, the 26 control number is 1,844.0 million. For fiscal 27, 1,836 million. And for fiscal 28, 1,909.4 million. We also have to do this comparison like we did on the general fund. We revised fiscal 26, and I want to show the impact of today's action on the budgetary side of things. This column right here is the December forecast, and it shows 50.3. Let's see. Relative to enacted in September, we were saying that there would be an $82.1 million shortfall in the road fund. In December, we've had an improvement in the revenues. So we're now saying that there's a $50.3 million difference between the enacted number and the current official estimate for December, which is a $31.8 million improvement over where we were at in September. So that's the budget map. All right. The only thing remaining is the MSA. And with that, I'm going to bring Dr. Michael Jones back up to conclude today's proceedings.
Well, nothing like ending it with a little coal in your stocking. I'm afraid the MSA numbers, we hit Shift F5 to start from the current slide.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Obviously, we've been through this many times, so I won't go through the individual slides. I will say that one of the things that we've talked about historically is the NPM adjustment. You know, the fact that the non-participating manufacturers, if they gain market share, it's possible that Kentucky could have been found non-diligent in enforcing the structure of the MSA. We have also talked about how we have settled many years of this. We are in ongoing negotiations to settle more years. That, of course, would prevent us from having to defend ourselves during an arbitration. We've also joked that it's a very slow process. They are currently working on the 2007-2008 sales years, but locking in the fact that we will not have to defend ourselves in an arbitration proceeding in the future is always good. But until we sign on the line which is dotted, I do not include such things in our forecast. So overall, the current revenue estimates down slightly from what was presented in September, 90.1 million in fiscal 26, 82.8 million in fiscal 27, and 77.4 million in fiscal 28. I cannot emphasize enough that there's a good chance, if it wasn't for the legal structure of the MSA, this would be moved into other taxes, other revenue sources. It's going to get smaller. In fact, the National Association of Attorney Generals has put out estimates all the way until early fiscal 30s, and they would imply that we would be looking at going under $50 million a year by, call it fiscal 30 to 32. So this is a declining revenue source. The amount of cigarettes being consumed is declining, and as I've said to you numerous times, if it was not for the inflation adjustment, the decrease in volumes alone would have eliminated the MSA as a revenue source many years ago. So, but these are the current estimates. Obviously, we do not do a pessimistic or optimistic on the estimates for the MSA. But of course, if there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, I would thank you for your time, wish you all a happy holiday season, and look forward to seeing you all, some of you for more other reasons than others, see you all, and we'll have plenty to discuss, I'm sure, as the economy continues to be interesting.
Likewise, and we'd like to thank the staff for another excellent presentation.
Thank you so much.